Before the first light of dawn, a pharaoh awakens. When he opens his eyes in his gold leaf bed, dozens of servants await him. He is not even allowed to dress himself. Everything is a ritual. Every movement is bound by a sacred rule. The pharaoh is not just a human being. He is the embodiment of the God on earth. But this divine status brings not freedom, but a golden cage. Tonight, we will discover that the most powerful people in ancient Egypt were also the most imprisoned. If you are ready, let us walk silently towards the pharaoh's palace. Many people imagine pharaohs as gods with unlimited power, capable of doing anything they desire. Golden crowns, massive palaces, thousands of slaves. But the reality is much more complex.
Pharaoh dit de possède immense power.
However, this power, while elevating them above ordinary humans, also alienated them from their own bodies and souls. They were not free. They were prisoners of religious rules, palace protocols, and the expectations of the people. Let's take a look at this strange and disturbing life together. In ancient Egypt, pharaohhood was not just a title. It was a divine duty. The pharaoh was considered the son of the sun god Ra. In the eyes of the people, he was a bridge between the gods and humans. This belief made every movement and every word of the pharaoh a sacred act. Everything from his morning rise to his nighttime sleep was part of a religious ceremony. The pharaoh could not eat at will, wear clothes of his own choosing, or even walk on his own. Everything was done according to rules set by priests and court officials. These rules remained unchanged for thousands of years, because the pharaoh's behavior symbolized the order of the universe. If the pharaoh took a wrong step, the gods could become angry, the Nile River might not overflow, and the country could be plunged into disaster. This belief placed the pharaoh under an immense responsibility. The pharaoh's day began with the sunrise. However, this was no ordinary awakening. Before the first rays of dawn appeared on the horizon, palace servants would quietly enter the room. None of them could look directly at the pharaoh. They turned their faces to the floor. They walked backwards. The pharaoh was a god, and looking directly at a god could blind one's eyes. This belief had created a strict protocol in the palace. The servants would come to the pharaoh's bedside. They would recite special prayers. Then they would wake him. As soon as the pharaoh awoke, the first ritual began, the purification ceremony. The pharaoh could have been under the influence of evil spirits throughout the night. Therefore, he had to be washed every morning with special waters. These waters were brought from the sacred sources of the Nile River. The priests chanted religious hymns as they poured the water over the pharaoh. This ceremony sometimes lasted an hour. The pharaoh waited silently.
Talking was forbidden.
Because during the morning ritual, the pharaoh had not yet fully come to life. His divine power only returned to his body once the ceremony was complete. After the bathing ceremony, it was time to get dressed. However, the pharaoh could not choose his own clothes. The priests decided which outfit would be worn each day. These outfits were chosen according to the religious ceremonies of the day, the season, and the position of the stars. The pharaoh's attire was usually a skirt and a headdress made of fine linen. The headdress was decorated with a cobra figure made of gold. This cobra symbolized the divine power of the pharaoh, which burned his enemies. Prayers were recited again while the clothes were being put on.
No one touched the pharaoh.
The garments were put on using long sticks or special tools. This was because the pharaoh's body was not something ordinary people could touch. Only the highest-ranking priests and the queen had the right to touch the pharaoh. This situation also isolated the pharaoh physically. He was a stranger even to his own body. This was because his body belonged not to him but to the gods. After the dressing ceremony, the morning ritual began. The pharaoh was taken to a temple in a special section of the palace. Here, He recited prayers and burned incense before the statues of the gods. This ritual was repeated every morning. The pharaoh offered daily tribute to the gods and begged for their favor. During the ritual, the pharaoh was completely isolated from his people. Only the high priest and a few select officials were present. The people could only see the pharaoh during special ceremonies and from a distance. This isolation made the pharaoh even lonelier. He was surrounded by thousands of people, but he could not form a real bond with any of them. Everyone worshipped him, but no one could talk to him. The pharaoh was a stranger in his own palace. After the morning ceremonies, the pharaoh would begin his daily duties. But these weren't ordinary tasks in the sense we understand them. The pharaoh was the ruler of the country, but also the high priest. He was both the political and religious authority. These two roles constantly intertwined. Every decision the pharaoh made had both political and religious consequences. For example, if a new temple was to be built, it wasn't just an architectural project. It was a gift offered to the gods. The pharaoh determined the location, size, and the god to whom it would be dedicated. However, he couldn't make these decisions alone. Priests, astronomers, viziers, everyone offered their opinions. The pharaoh listened to all this information before making his decision. But making decisions wasn't easy, because a wrong decision could incur the wrath of the gods. This pressure poisoned every moment of the pharaoh's life. One of the pharaoh's most important duties was to protect Maat. In ancient Egypt, Maat meant order, justice, and balance. The proper functioning of the universe depended on the protection of Maat. The pharaoh was the guardian of the Maat. If injustice, chaos, or disaster struck the country, it was seen as the pharaoh's failure. The people held the pharaoh responsible because he was a god, and the god's duty was to maintain order. This belief placed an enormous psychological burden on the pharaoh. Every famine, every flood, every epidemic led to questioning the pharaoh's power. The pharaoh had to learn to live with this pressure, but it eventually wore him down. At midday, a meal ceremony was held for the pharaoh. However, the pharaoh did not eat casually in the way we understand it. Eating had become a ceremony. The table was laden with golden plates. The food was prepared by the best cooks. But the pharaoh did not sit alone. Dozens of attendants waited around him. Special attendants tasted the food, because poisoning was always a threat. There were always those who wanted to eliminate the pharaoh in the palace intrigues. Therefore, every bite, every drink was first tasted by an attendant before being offered to the pharaoh. Even while eating, the pharaoh was not at ease. His every move was watched by his officials. Even the way the pharaoh ate had to conform to protocol. If the pharaoh were to push away a dish with the back of his hand, it could be perceived as an insult. Therefore, every movement had to be measured and controlled. In the afternoon, the pharaoh usually went out to the palace garden. But this wasn't a stroll. It was part of a ceremony. The pharaoh was carried in a special carrier or on a gold-plated chair. Putting his feet on the ground wasn't always appropriate, as certain areas were considered religiously unclean. The pharaoh had to take each step carefully. The palace garden was a large and magnificent area. Palm trees, lotus flowers, ornamental pools. This was one of the few places where the pharaoh could breathe. Yet he was not alone. He was surrounded by officials, guards, and servants. Even while sitting in the garden, the pharaoh listened to the petitions of the people. The viziers presented their complaints, requests, and problems. The pharaoh listened to each one and made decisions. However, these decisions were extremely tiring, because a wrong decision could cost someone their life. One of the most disturbing aspects of a pharaoh's life was their marriages and family relationships. In ancient Egypt, pharaohs typically married within their own families. This was to preserve the purity of their divine blood. Pharaohs married their sisters, nieces, and even, in some cases, their daughters. While this practice may seem extremely disturbing from a modern perspective, it was a normalized tradition at the time. Even the gods married each other. For example, Osiris and Isis were both siblings and spouses. Since pharaohs were the earthly representatives of the gods, they should do the same. However, these marriages led to psychological and physical problems. Generational consanguineous marriages caused genetic disorders, diseases, and shorter lifespans. Many pharaohs died young. Examination of their bones revealed serious health problems.
Pharaoh could have multiple wives.
The queen mother held the highest status. However, the pharaoh also had dozens of concubines, or junior wives. These women lived in the harem section of the palace. The harem was a large structure, but it was also a prison. The women couldn't leave. The pharaoh would visit them. However, these visits were not emotional but rather functional. The pharaoh's goal was to have a male heir, because a male child would inherit the throne. If the pharaoh did not have a male heir, power struggles would begin. Therefore, the pharaoh was constantly under pressure. Even his relationships with his wives were a political and religious duty. Love, passion, emotional bonds, all of these were secondary. The pharaoh's children could not have an ordinary childhood either. Boys learned martial arts, governance, and religious knowledge from a young age.
Girls learned protocol, music, and dance.
However, none of them played freely. Everything was done within the framework of rules. The pharaoh's children did not play with other children, because they were not ordinary children. They were of divine blood. This isolation affected the children's psychology. Many princes and princesses had lonely and unhappy childhoods. Some, as adults, would try to take revenge for this loneliness. Many palace intrigues were initiated by princes who grew up this way. Now let's move on to one of the most mysterious and disturbing aspects of the pharaohs: the mummification process and preparations for the afterlife. Pharaohs believed they would continue to live after death. This belief completely shaped their lives. From the moment they ascended the throne, they began preparing their own tombs. Pyramids, massive temples, tomb complexes, all were projects that took years. The pharaoh would supervise the construction of his tomb every day. This was a necessity for him, because his tomb was where he would live after death. If the tomb wasn't ready, the pharaoh's soul would be lost. Even while alive, pharaohs thought about the afterlife. This heavily affected their minds. They constantly imagined their own deaths, planned the mummification process, approved the paintings on the tomb walls, and determined the details of the funeral ceremonies. Some pharaohs were overwhelmed by these thoughts and fell into depression, because for them, death was not an end, but a new beginning. And if this beginning wasn't properly prepared, it could turn into a disaster. If there wasn't enough food in the tomb, the soul would starve. If mummification was done incorrectly, the body would decay, and the soul wouldn't find its body.
All these thoughts gnawed at the minds of the pharaoh.
The mummification process was extremely long and complex. When a pharaoh died, his body was immediately given to special priests who were experts in mummification. The process took about 70 days. First, the brain was removed through a nostril. The brain was considered an unimportant organ because ancient Egyptians believed that thought originated in the heart. Then, an incision was made in the abdominal area, and the internal organs were removed. The lungs, liver, stomach, and intestines were all dried separately in natron salt. Then these organs were placed in special jars. Each jar was under the protection of a god. The heart, however, was left in the body because it would be weighed in the afterlife. If the heart weighed more than the feather of death, the soul would be destroyed. This was the greatest fear for the pharaohs. After the internal organs were removed, the body was left in natron salt for 40 days. During this process, the body would lose all its moisture. Then the body would be washed, rubbed with special oils, and coated with resins. Afterward, it would be wrapped in thin linen cloths. This wrapping process was done in layers. Between each layer, amulets, prayers, and written papyri were placed. When mummification was complete, the body was unrecognizable. However, this was a necessary transformation for the pharaoh's eternal life. The mummy was placed in a special coffin. The coffin was covered in gold, and the pharaoh's face was painted on it. Then this coffin was placed inside larger coffins. The outermost coffin was a sarcophagus made of granite or basalt. All these protective measures were to prevent the body from decaying. The funeral ceremony was a magnificent spectacle. But for the pharaoh, this was not a farewell. It was the beginning of a new journey. The funeral procession stretched from the palace to the tomb. Thousands of people wailed and recited prayers. Priests burned incense and sang hymns. The pharaoh's mummy was transported in a golden boat. This boat crossed to the other side of the Nile River because the land of the dead was on the west bank. The sun set in the west, so those who died lived in the west. When the mummy reached the tomb, a special ceremony was performed, the mouth-opening ceremony. During this ceremony, priests would touch the mummy's mouth, eyes, and ears with special tools. This allowed the pharaoh's soul to inhabit the body. The pharaoh could now see, hear, speak, and breathe. The tomb was filled with treasures, gold objects, jewels, food, drinks, furniture, chariots, weapons, and even figures of servants. These figures were called ashapti. The ashapti would serve the pharaoh in the afterlife. If the gods requested a task from the pharaoh, he would perform it in place of the ashapti. The tomb was designed as a living space. The pharaoh would live here forever. However, this life was still governed by rules. Every night, the pharaoh would account to the gods. Every day, he would pray to the gods. Even the end of his life did not bring him freedom.
Another disturbing element in the lives of the Pharaoh was a palace intrigue.
The palace was not only a magnificent living space, it was also a dark place where conspiracies, murders, and betrayals took place. The pharaoh was constantly under threat. Viziers, priests, princes, and even members of their own families plotted to seize the throne. History shows that many pharaohs were killed or deposed. Some were poisoned, others assassinated. Therefore, pharaohs had to be constantly vigilant. They couldn't trust anyone. One of the most famous palace intrigues is the plot against Pharaoh Ramses' third concubine. One of Ramses' younger wives wanted her son to ascend the throne. To this end, she collaborated with other harem women, some courtiers, and even some soldiers. The plot aimed to kill the pharaoh. However, the plot was discovered. All the culprits were caught and executed. However, historians believe that Ramses himself was wounded in this plot and died shortly afterward. This event demonstrates how vulnerable pharaohs were.
Golden crown, divine statue.
None of them could protect them. Another cause of palace intrigues was the inheritance issue. If the pharaoh had more than one son, which one would ascend the throne? Usually, the son of the queen mother was considered the first heir. However, in some cases, the sons of younger wives also claimed a right. This led to rivalry among the princes. Some princes plotted assassinations to eliminate their brothers. Some plotted to seize the throne before their father died. The pharaoh couldn't even trust his own sons. This poisoned family relationships. The pharaoh kept his distance from his own children, not forming close relationships with them, because one of those children might try to kill him tomorrow. One of the pharaoh's greatest fears was being forgotten. According to ancient Egyptian belief, a person lived only as long as their name was remembered. If a pharaoh's name was forgotten, their soul would also perish. Therefore, Pharaohs had their names inscribed everywhere. On temple walls, statues, obelisks, tomb walls. The pharaoh's name had to be everywhere. Some pharaohs, out of fear, would erase the names of previous pharaohs, inscribing their own names on the monuments of others. This was the practice of damnatio memoriae, or erasing from memory. If a pharaoh hated a previous one, they would destroy all of that pharaoh's monuments, thus erasing that pharaoh from history. One of the most difficult periods in a pharaoh's life was old age. Pharaohs ascended the throne at a young age, but their power waned as they aged. Illnesses, physical weakness, sometimes mental problems. However, a pharaoh was a god, and a god is not weak. Therefore, aging pharaohs tried to conceal their condition. They wouldn't leave the palace, avoided ceremonies, and stayed away from the people. However, this increased the power of the viziers and priests. A weakening pharaoh gradually lost his authority. In some cases, the viziers seized real power, turning the pharaoh into a puppet. Some pharaohs considered abdicating, but this was impossible, because being a pharaoh was not a duty, but a state of being. The pharaoh could not abdicate. He was pharaoh until the end of his life. Some pharaohs would declare their sons co-rulers, thus guaranteeing their sons' ascension to the throne before their death. However, even this could lead to problems. If two pharaohs ruled simultaneously, which one held the real authority? In some cases, conflicts arose between father and son. Another disturbing aspect of the pharaohs was warfare. The pharaoh was not only a ruler but also a commander of the army. Egypt frequently went to war with neighboring countries: the Hittites, Nubians, Assyrians, and Phoenicians. The pharaoh would lead the army into battle, but this was extremely dangerous. The pharaoh could lose his life on the battlefield. If the pharaoh died in battle, it was a great catastrophe, because the loss of a god's life would disrupt the order of the universe. Therefore, pharaohs were under special protection in battle. The best soldiers surrounded the pharaoh. Golden armor, the best weapons, the fastest chariots were all given to the pharaoh. However, some pharaohs were wounded in battle. Some were taken prisoner. These situations led to great scandals in history. For example, Pharaoh Valabris was defeated by Cambyses of Persia. Egypt fell into the hands of the Persians. This was a dark period for Egyptian history. The pharaoh was no longer a true ruler. He was merely a puppet governor of the Persian king. The Egyptians could not tolerate this humiliation of their god. The people began to revolt. However, the revolts were suppressed. The pharaoh's divine image had suffered a major blow. There were also infamous pharaohs. Some were known for their cruelty. They oppressed the people, levied excessive taxes, and enslaved them. Some ruled solely through fear. And this raises an interesting question. Did the pharaohs truly see themselves as gods? Or was it all a role? Modern historians offer different answers. Some say that the pharaohs knew deep down that they were ordinary people, but they had to play this role. Others believe that a pharaoh raised this way from a young age could genuinely see himself as a god.
Perhaps the truth lay somewhere in between.
Perhaps at times the pharaohs truly felt godlike, while at other times they realized they were merely human. This internal conflict must have profoundly affected their psychology. Another dark aspect of the pharaohs' lives was the practice of human sacrifice. In early Egypt, particularly during the First Dynasty, when a pharaoh died, their servants were buried with them. This meant that living people were sacrificed to be placed in the tomb alongside the pharaoh. Archaeologists have found dozens of skeletons neatly arranged around the pharaoh in some ancient tombs. These people were killed so that they could serve the pharaoh in the afterlife. This practice decreased in later periods. Servant figures called usabti began to be used instead of living people. However, in the early periods, the death of a pharaoh meant the death of dozens of innocent people. In addition to the servants, some pharaohs' wives were also buried with them. It was not considered appropriate for a queen to live after the pharaoh's death. In some cases, queens voluntarily chose to die alongside their pharaohs. However, in some cases, this was not a choice but a necessity. The queen would drink poison and drown. Then she would be mummified and placed next to the pharaoh. This practice seems extremely barbaric from today's perspective. However, at that time, it was considered a normal ritual, because the pharaoh and queen should be together even after death. A pharaoh's ascension to the throne wasn't always without problems either. Some pharaohs came to power through coups. For example, Pharaoh Hormheb was a soldier. He didn't come from a noble family. However, he seized power during a period of royal turmoil and declared himself pharaoh. Hormheb destroyed the works of previous pharaohs and had his own name inscribed everywhere. This was a kind of historical rewriting. Hormheb wanted to appear as a legitimate pharaoh. Therefore, he altered history. Similarly, Pharaoh Hatshepsut was one of the most interesting pharaohs in history.
Hatshepsut was a woman.
However, in Egypt, pharaohs were usually men. Hatshepsut began as regent for her stepson Tutmosis. But over time, she completely seized power and declared herself pharaoh. Interestingly, Hatshepsut had herself depicted as a man. In statues and reliefs, she was always shown wearing a false beard and dressed like a man. This was a radical step that challenged societal gender norms. However, Hatshepsut became a successful ruler. She governed the country well and opened trade routes. She commissioned the construction of great temples. But after her death, attempts were made to destroy her monuments. Perhaps this was revenge, as she had been overshadowed by her mother, Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut's name was forgotten for centuries. The religious lives of the pharaohs were also extremely complex. Ancient Egypt was a place where hundreds of gods were worshipped. Every city, every region had its own god. The pharaoh had to show respect to all these gods. He had to build temples for each god, hold ceremonies, and offer sacrifices. This meant an enormous workload. The pharaoh constantly went from one temple to another. He performed separate ceremonies for each god. These ceremonies lasted for hours. The pharaoh would stand, recite prayers, burn incense, and offer sacrifices. It was extremely physically exhausting. However, some pharaohs tried to change this complex religious system. The most radical change was made by Pharaoh Ahanato.
Ahanato rejected all the gods.
He said that only one god, the sun disk Athena, should be worshipped. This was the first monotheistic revolution in history. Eneton closed the old temples, stripped the priests of their power, and built a new capital, naming it Eneton, meaning Horizon of Aten. He declared himself the sole representative of Aten. However, this revolution led to great turmoil. The old priests rebelled against Eneton, the people demanded the return of their gods, and the army became uneasy. Eneton reigned for 17 years, but after his death, everything reverted to its former state. The new pharaoh, the young Tutankhamun, declared a return to the old gods. All of Eneton's monuments were destroyed, and attempts were made to erase his name from history. The city of Eneton was abandoned and forgotten. Eneton's religious revolution failed, but his ideas may have inspired later monotheistic religions. Pharaohs were not only religious leaders but also economic rulers. All of Egypt's resources theoretically belonged to the pharaoh: land, mines, trade routes, everything. The pharaoh decided how to use these resources. Taxes were collected and deposited into the treasury. These taxes were spent on temple construction, feeding the army, and palace expenses. However, over time, mismanagement or natural disasters would lead to economic crises. The Nile River sometimes didn't flood sufficiently, resulting in poor crop yields. Famine would begin. The people would suffer from hunger. During such times of crisis, The pharaoh would be under great pressure because the people held him responsible. If the Nile didn't flood, it meant the pharaoh had angered the gods. The pharaoh would hold special ceremonies and plead with the gods. But sometimes this wasn't enough. The famine would last a long time, and the people would revolt. In some periods, pharaohs lost their thrones because the people no longer saw them as gods. If they were gods, they wouldn't starve their people. There was very little entertainment and rest in the lives of pharaohs. Yes, there were musicians, dancers, and jesters in the palace. The pharaoh would have feasts organized. But even these feasts were bound by protocol. The pharaoh couldn't laugh freely, sing, or dance. Everything had to be measured. Because the pharaoh was a god, and gods didn't behave like ordinary people. Some pharaohs enjoyed hunting. Hunting was a way for the pharaoh to show his courage. The pharaoh would hunt lions. These were dangerous hunts. However, the pharaoh would prove his strength by fighting the lions. When he killed a lion, this event would be depicted on the temple walls. It conveyed the message that the powerful pharaoh crushed his enemies like a lion. However, in reality, the lion might not have been defeated by the pharaoh. The soldiers would first weaken the lion, then bring it before the pharaoh. The pharaoh would deliver the final blow. Thus, all the victory belonged to the pharaoh. Such tricks were frequently used because the pharaoh had to always be perfect in the eyes of the people. The pharaoh's relationships were not limited to his family. Thousands of people worked in the palace: servants, guards, cooks, cleaners, scribes, priests, soldiers, each with their own duties. However, the pharaoh didn't even know most of them. The pharaoh only spoke with the highest-ranking officials: the vizier, the chief priest, the army commander. The rest were invisible to the pharaoh. This further increased the pharaoh's loneliness. He lived among thousands of people but couldn't form genuine bonds with anyone. The hierarchy in the palace was extremely strict. Everyone knew their place. A servant could never be in the same room as a vizier. A soldier would never sit at the same table as a priest. This rigid hierarchy fragmented the palace. People could only communicate through their own muscles. This made the palace a cold and distant place. The pharaoh, however, stood completely alone at the top of this entire hierarchy. Now, let's come to the most mysterious days of the pharaohs, the coronation ceremony. When a pharaoh died, his son ascended the throne. But this transition was not a simple event. The coronation ceremony was a series of rituals lasting for days. The new pharaoh first underwent a special purification. His body was washed and rubbed with special oils. Then he would go to the temple of the old pharaoh. There, he would recite prayers for his father's soul. Then the high priest would place the royal crown on the new pharaoh's head. This crown consisted of two parts, symbolizing Upper and Lower Egypt. Once the crown was placed, the new pharaoh was now a god. After the coronation ceremony, the new pharaoh was shown to the people. Thousands of people would gather to see the new pharaoh. The pharaoh sat on a golden throne. The people bowed before him, worshiping their god. This moment was the most glorious moment of the pharaoh's life, but also the beginning of the heaviest burden. He was no longer just a man, but a god, and the responsibility of gods was immense. Some pharaohs ascended the throne at a very young age. For example, Tutankhamun became pharaoh when he was only 9 years old. How could a 9-year-old child rule a country? Of course, he couldn't. In that case, the viziers and priests held the real power. The young pharaoh would be merely a symbol. However, as he grew older, he would try to establish his own authority. Sometimes he succeeded, sometimes he remained nothing more than a puppet throughout his life. Tutankhamun died at the age of 19. The cause of his death is still debated. Some say he died of illness. Others believe he was murdered. A fracture was found in his skull. Perhaps an accident, perhaps an assassination. When Tutankhamun's tomb was discovered centuries later, the world was astonished. The tomb was filled with treasures, a golden coffin, jewels, a throne, chariots. However, all this wealth did not bring happiness to the young pharaoh. He lived a short and probably unhappy life. Writing, music, was also important for pharaohs. Hieroglyphs were the sacred writing system of ancient Egypt. Pharaohs were literate because they needed to understand the language of the gods. Pharaohs wrote decrees. These decrees were inscribed on stone pillars and papyri. Each decree was approved with the pharaoh's seal. The pharaoh's seal was a sacred symbol. If a document bore the pharaoh's seal, it was considered a divine command. No one could challenge it. However, some pharaohs did not write their own documents. Scribes wrote for them. Scribes held important positions in the palace. They were literate people. In Egypt, being literate was a great privilege. Most people were illiterate. Therefore, scribes were both respected and feared, because they could open the doors to knowledge. Another responsibility of the pharaohs was to ensure justice. In Egypt, the pharaoh was the highest court. Major cases were brought before the pharaoh. The pharaoh would listen and decide. However, these decisions were not always fair, as the pharaoh sometimes made decisions based on personal interests. In some cases, powerful individuals would take sides. The pharaoh wouldn't want to antagonize these powerful individuals. In that case, justice would take a back seat. Punishments in Egypt were severe. A thief had their hand cut off. Murderers were executed. Those who committed treason had their tongues cut out. These punishments were meant to instill fear in the people. The pharaoh represented harsh justice, because order could only be maintained through fear. However, some pharaohs were more merciful. They preferred to pardon and lighten punishments. Such pharaohs were loved by the people. But the priests and viziers considered them weak. Finally, let's look at what happened after the death of a pharaoh. When a pharaoh died, the country went into summer. A period of official mourning was declared for 70 days. The people wore black clothes. Summer ceremonies were held in the temples. Flowers were thrown into the Nile River. Prayers were recited for the pharaoh's soul. These 70 days were also the mummification period. Once mummification was complete, a funeral ceremony was held. Then a new pharaoh ascended the throne. Life went on. However, some pharaohs could not find peace even after death. Tomb robbers targeted the rich tombs. Despite secret entrances and traps, many tombs were plundered. Mummies were desecrated, and treasures were stolen. This jeopardized the pharaoh's eternal life, because if the mummy was destroyed, the soul could not find its way back to the body. This was the greatest fear of these pharaohs. Some pharaohs' tombs were never found. Perhaps they are still hidden somewhere beneath the sands. Perhaps they were better protected from looters. Modern archaeologists continue to search for new tombs. Each new discovery reveals new information about ancient Egypt. Perhaps one day a lost pharaoh's tomb will be found. Perhaps that tomb will reveal all the secrets. From the outside, the lives of the pharaohs seemed magnificent.
Golden crown, énorme palace, boundless power.
But the reality was far more complex and disturbing. The pharaohs were not free. They were prisoners of religious rules, palace protocols, and the expectations of the people. They woke up to the same rituals every morning. They performed the same ceremonies every day. They were even strangers to their own bodies, because their bodies belonged not to them, but to the gods. Pharaohs could not form genuine relationships with their families. Their marriages were political agreements. Their children were potential heirs. They had no friends, because no one could befriend a god. They were alone in their palaces. They were surrounded by thousands of people, but they could not form a true bond with any of them. Every day they contemplated their end. For them, it was not just an end, but the beginning of a new test. Pharaohs feared assassinations, poison, and the Comolos. They couldn't even trust their own families. Their sons, brothers, and wives were all potential enemies. This fear slowly consumed their spirits. Some pharaohs became paranoid, suspicious of everyone. Some fell into depression. Others became cruel.
The legacy of the Pharaohs still stand today.
The colossal pyramids, temples, and statues are proof of their power. But they are also a sign of their desperation. Because all these structures were built so that they would not be forgotten. Pharaohs wanted to be remembered even after their lives. Because as long as they were remembered, they would exist. Today, the mummies of pharaohs are displayed in museums. People look at them, take photographs. These people, who were once gods, are now mere objects of display. Perhaps this is the greatest irony of history.
Pharaoh wanted to live forever.
In a way, they succeeded, but not as they wished. Tonight, we discovered the story of the most powerful people of ancient Egypt. We witnessed their magnificent yet unsettling lives. Perhaps your eyes are now closed. Perhaps you have fallen into a deep sleep. Either way, this journey has come to an end.
The spirit of the Pharaohs still awe beneath sands.
Perhaps they are now searching in silence for the peace they never found. It was a privilege to show you this mysterious world.
Tomorrow, a new story, a new mystery awaits.
But for now, good night, sweet dreams.
And remember, sometimes the greatest power bring with it the greatest loneliness.